Tonight, we journey to a city that called itself eternal. A city that rose from marshland and myth, that spread its influence across 3 continents, that shaped the world we inhabit in ways we rarely recognize. Rome, the name itself carries weight, carries centuries of accumulated meaning, carries the echo of legions marching and orators speaking, and emperors ascending to power only to fall into darkness. The story stretches across 1,000 years of growth and 5 centuries of decline, encompasses millions of lives, transforms landscapes from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. But we do not tell this story as history is usually told. Not as sequence of battles and dates, not as catalogue of emperors and conquests. We tell it as experience, as a slow accumulation of days into years into centuries, as the weight of stone laid upon stone until monuments rise, as the gradual fading when maintenance ceases and time begins its patient work of dissolution. We walk through Rome not as tourists seeking sights, but as dreamers seeking understanding, moving slowly through temples and forums, along roads and aqueducts, into arenas where blood was spilled for entertainment and chambers where laws were written that would outlast the civilization that created them. The rise was gradual, village becoming town, becoming city, becoming empire, each generation building upon what predecessors had laid, each achievement making the next possible. The fall was equally gradual, so slow that those who lived through it debated whether it was happening at all, so gentle in some places that Roman ways persisted for centuries after Roman power had vanished. Between the rise and fall stretched the long plateau of Empire, the Pax Romana, when roads were safe and trade flourished, when aqueducts brought mountain water to city fountains, when a citizen could travel from Scotland to Syria and find familiar institutions, familiar language, familiar ways of being Roman. What made Rome eternal was not its duration, but its influence, the ways it shaped everything that followed. The laws and languages and architectural forms and political concepts that passed from Rome to medieval Europe to the modern world. We are Rome's heirs, whether we know it or not. The roads we drive follow routes Romans surveyed. The laws that govern us derive from principles Romans articulated. The languages we speak evolved from Latin or were shaped by contact with Latin speakers. The very idea of civilization, of cities and citizenship, of public spaces and private rights, of empire and its discontents, bears Rome's imprint. Tonight, we trace that influence to its source. We begin where Rome began, on 7 hills above a river, where wolves nursed abandoned twins and shepherds dreamed of something greater than tending flocks. We follow Rome's growth from village to republic to empire, its expansion across the Mediterranean world, its transformation under emperors who claimed divine status, its slow decline as pressures mounted that its institutions could not withstand. We witness the fall, or rather, the transformation. For Rome did not so much fall as dissolve into what came after, seeding the medieval world with fragments of classical civilization that would eventually flower into Renaissance and modernity. The journey is long. The centuries accumulate. The voices multiply and then fall silent. But the stones remain, and the stones remember. Let us listen to what they have to tell us. Let us walk where Romans walked. Let us feel the weight of eternity that Rome promised and partially delivered. The eternal city awaits. Its gates stand open to those who approach with patience and wonder. The story begins where all stories begin, with a birth, a founding, a moment when something emerged from nothing and the world was changed forever. Now, let us enter the city that time has touched, but not erased. Let us begin with the 7 hills where wolves once nursed the children who would build an empire. In the pale light, before recorded time, 7 hills rose from the marshlands of the Tiber, their slopes thick with oak and laurel, their summits touched by mists that seemed to carry whispers from worlds yet unformed. The Palatine, the Capitoline, the Aventine, the Caelian, the Esquiline, the Viminal, the Quirinal, names that would become sacred, that would bear temples and palaces, that would witness the transformation of a humble village into capital of the world. But in the beginning, there was only the land itself, the river winding toward the sea, the hills providing refuge from floods, the valleys between them green with possibility. Here, where shepherds watched their flocks beneath stars that had witnessed the birth of earlier civilizations now turned to dust. A city would emerge that would one day command the known world. But the beginning was humble, was myth woven with mud, was legend pressed into the soft earth of memory. The Romans themselves knew their origins only through stories passed down across generations. Stories that blended fact with fancy, until the two could not be separated, until the founding became sacred narrative, rather than historical event. The story opens not with conquest, but with abandonment. Twin infants, Romulus and Remus, born of a priestess named Rhea Silvia, and the god Mars himself, or so the legend claims. Their grandfather Numitor had been king of Alba Longa, until his brother Amulius seized the throne, forcing Rhea Silvia to become a Vestal virgin so she would bear no heirs to challenge his rule. But the gods had other plans. Mars visited her and she conceived twins whose very existence threatened Amulius's power. The fearful king ordered the infants drowned in the Tiber. But the river was swollen with spring floods, and the servants tasked with the killing could not reach the deep water. They left the basket at the river's edge, perhaps hoping the current would carry it away, perhaps hoping some miracle would intervene. The basket floated downstream, came to rest beneath a fig tree, the Ficus ruminalis, in the shadow of the Palatine hill. And there, in that liminal space between water and land, between death and life, a she-wolf discovered the crying children. The image haunts across millennia, the wolf's amber eyes regarding the human infants, her body lowering to offer milk to creatures not her own, the boundary between beast and divine blurring into something sacred. Later Romans would erect statues of this scene, would make the wolf their symbol, would see in the strange nursing a sign that their city was destined for greatness from its first breath. The wolf represented wildness tamed, nature serving human purpose, the savage transformed into the protective. Rome would carry this paradox throughout its history, the tension between civilization and the violence that created and maintained it. A shepherd named Faustulus discovered the twins, brought them to his wife Acca Larentia, raised them as his own. The boys grew strong and wild, became leaders among the young shepherds, eventually learned their true identity and overthrew Amulius, restoring their grandfather to his throne. But Alba Longa could not hold them. They returned to the place where the wolf had nursed them, determined to found a new city on the hills above the Tiber. The founding was marked by violence, the template for much that would follow. The twins quarreled over which hill should be the city's center, over who should rule, over the very name the new settlement would bear. Romulus chose the Palatine. Remus preferred the Aventine. They sought omens from the gods, watching the sky for birds whose flight would indicate divine preference. Remus saw 6 vultures. Romulus claimed 12. The dispute grew heated. When Remus mockingly leapt over the low wall, Romulus had begun to build, perhaps to demonstrate its inadequacy, perhaps simply in contempt. Romulus killed him. Brother murdered brother at the city's founding. The blood of Remus soaked into the earth of the Palatine, became part of the city's foundation, sanctified the walls with sacrifice that was also fratricide. Romulus became sole ruler, gave his name to the city, Roma, and began the work of building that would continue for 1,000 years. The violence of the founding would echo through Roman history, would repeat in civil wars and political murders, would suggest that Rome was built not only on hills, but on blood. But beneath the myth, archaeology reveals different stories. The hills were inhabited long before any legendary founding. Settlements dating back to the 10th century BCE, perhaps earlier, have left traces in post holes and pottery shards, in burial sites and building foundations. The people who lived here were Latins, one of many Italic peoples who inhabited the peninsula, influenced by Etruscans to the north and Greeks who had established colonies in the south. The transition from scattered villages to unified city was gradual, was process rather than event, was the slow accumulation of cooperation and conflict that creates all cities. The Palatine Hill reveals its secrets reluctantly. Excavations have uncovered huts from the 8th century BCE, oval structures of wood and thatch, their post holes still visible in bedrock, their shapes suggesting homes for shepherds and farmers rather than founders of empire. These humble dwellings became sacred in later centuries. Romans preserved them as relics, pointed to them as evidence of how far they had come, honored the simplicity of origins that made subsequent magnificence more impressive. The Forum Valley between the hills was marshy in early centuries, waterlogged ground where the hills drained their rains, where reeds grew thick and herons waded through shallow pools, reflecting empty sky. The transformation from wetland to civic center was among Rome's first great achievements. Required drainage that demonstrated engineering capability, revealed solid ground where gatherings could occur, where markets could flourish, where the communal life that defines cities could take root. The Capitoline Hill became religious center early, its summit bearing temples to Jupiter and Juno and Minerva, the Capitoline Triad who would protect Rome throughout its history. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, though rebuilt multiple times after fires, remained Rome's most sacred site, the destination of triumphal processions, the place where generals thanked the gods for victories that expanded Roman power. The hill's name would give us the word capital, would be replicated in capital cities across the world that inherited Rome's political vocabulary. We close this chapter standing where Romulus might have stood, if Romulus existed, if the founding happened as legend claims. On the Palatine at twilight, watching the sun descend behind hills that would bear temples and palaces, feeling the weight of what was beginning without knowing what it would become. The marshes spread below, not yet drained. The other hills rise in shadow, not yet crowned with monuments. The future stretches forward, invisible but present, containing everything that will come. The Republic and the Empire, the conquests and the falls, the glory and the horror, the eternity that was promised and the ending that came nonetheless. The wolves have withdrawn to forests that will be cleared for farmland. The shepherds tend flocks that will be replaced by citizens. The hills wait to receive the weight of civilization. Rome is beginning. Rome is always beginning. The first stone is laid. The first wall rises. The first blood soaks into earth that will receive so much more before the story ends. The 7 hills, the wolf and the twins, the murder that consecrated the walls, the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The beginning that contained, somehow, both the glory and the fall. The story has started. The city has been founded. The centuries await. Before the marble columns rose, before the triumphal arches framed processions of conquest, before the rostra echoed with speeches that would shape the fate of nations. The space that would become the Roman Forum was water, brackish pools where the hills drained their rains, reed-choked wetland where frogs sang and herons waded, ground too soft for building, too wet for gathering, too wild for the order that cities require. The transformation from marsh to civic heart was Rome's first great act of will imposed upon nature. The moment when human determination began reshaping landscape into monument. The Cloaca Maxima, that great drain carved through earth and stone, was engineering marvel of the ancient world. Tradition attributed it to the Etruscan kings who ruled Rome before the Republic, particularly to Tarquinius Superbus, the last and most tyrannical of those foreign monarchs. The drain collected water from the surrounding hills, channeled it through covered passages, carried it to the Tiber and eventually to the sea. The construction required moving earth and stone on massive scale, required labor that later Romans associated with the oppression of monarchy, required vision that could see solid ground where only marsh existed. When the water drained away, the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline revealed itself. Flat ground in a landscape of hills, natural gathering place where paths converged, space that almost demanded communal use. The Forum was born, not from design, but from geography, from the simple fact that flat ground was precious and the drained marsh provided it. First came informal gatherings, farmers meeting to trade, disputes requiring resolution, religious observances that needed open space. Then came the structures that made temporary gathering permanent. The earliest forum was a marketplace, was place of exchange where grain and livestock changed hands, where craftsmen displayed their wares, where the economic life of the growing city found its center. The Latin word forum meant simply an open space, a marketplace, carried no grand political connotations. But in Rome, the forum would become something more, would become the heart of civic life, the stage upon which the drama of Roman history would unfold, the space where republic was born and died, where emperors were acclaimed and assassinated, where the fate of the Mediterranean world was debated and decided. The temples came early, establishing the forum as sacred as well as commercial space. The temple of Vesta housed the eternal flame that symbolized Rome's continuity, tended by Vestal virgins, whose purity was believed essential to the city's survival. The temple of Saturn served as state treasury, its basement vaults holding the wealth that funded armies and administration. The temple of Castor and Pollux commemorated divine intervention at the Battle of Lake Regillus, where the twin gods allegedly appeared to fight alongside Roman cavalry. Each temple added weight to the forum, transformed open space into sacred precinct, made the commercial center also religious center. The political institutions found their homes around the forum's edges. The comitium, that circular assembly space where citizens gathered to vote, occupied the forum's northwest corner, positioned so that speakers could address crowds while citizens arranged themselves by tribe and century for the complex voting procedures of the Republic. The Curia, meeting place of the Senate, stood nearby, modest building whose plain exterior belied the power concentrated within, where 300 senators debated matters of war and peace, of law and finance, of everything that concerned the Roman state. The rostra, that speaker's platform decorated with the prows of captured ships, faced the forum's open space, created stage from which orators could address thousands, could sway opinion, could shape history through the power of words. The Visakra, the sacred way, entered the forum from the east, wound through the valley, climbed toward the Capitoline and the Temple of Jupiter. Along this route, triumphal processions marched when generals returned victorious from foreign wars. The general rode in chariot, face painted red like Jupiter's statue, dressed in purple toga embroidered with gold, preceded by magistrates and followed by his army and the spoils of conquest, captured weapons and treasures, paintings depicting battles won, and most dramatically the defeated enemy kings and generals who would be executed at the procession's end, or paraded as evidence of Rome's irresistible power. We linger on specific days when the forum witnessed history. The morning when the last king was expelled and the Republic was declared, if such a single morning ever existed, for the transition was likely more gradual than legend suggests. the afternoon when the 12 tables were displayed on bronze tablets, making law public for the first time, establishing that citizens had right to know what rules governed them. The day when news arrived of Hannibal's victory at Cannae, when tens of thousands of Roman soldiers lay dead in Apulian dust, when the city faced the possibility of extinction and somehow found the will to continue. The Forum of the Republic was crowded and chaotic, temples and monuments packed into limited space, each generation adding structures that competed for attention, the accumulation of centuries creating labyrinth of buildings whose relationships only the most learned could explain. The space that had been open marketplace became dense forest of columns and statues and commemorative monuments, each marking some victory or honoring some benefactor, each claiming portion of sacred ground for particular memory. We witnessed the Forum's transformation under the dictators and emperors who replaced the Republic. Caesar began rebuilding, clearing old structures to create more ordered space, planning the Forum that would bear his name adjacent to the old Forum. Augustus completed Caesar's work and added his own Forum, created architectural ensemble that proclaimed new order of imperial rule. Subsequent emperors added their forums, Nerva, Trajan, until the original Forum was surrounded by imperial additions, was dwarfed by the scale of monuments that later rulers erected to glorify themselves. The assassination of Caesar happened not in the Forum, but in the theatre of Pompeii. Yet the body was brought to the Forum for funeral, was displayed on the rostra where he had spoken, was cremated on a pyre while the crowd mourned and rioted and made clear that the Republic's defenders had misjudged the people's mood. The spot where Caesar's body burned became shrine, became temple to the divine Julius, became marker of the moment when Republic ended and Empire began, though none knew it at the time, though the transition would take another generation to complete. The Forum's decline was slow and undramatic. The centuries of empire gradually shifting power elsewhere, the ceremonies moving to imperial palaces, the commercial activity dispersing to other markets. When the Western Empire fell, the Forum remained, but its meaning faded. Medieval Romans called it Campo Vaccino, the cow field, grazed cattle among the ruins of temples, used fallen columns as quarries for lime, forgot what the inscriptions meant, lost connection to the voices that had once echoed from the rostra. We close this chapter at dusk, the Forum empty now of living voices, inhabited only by shadows and the memory of what was spoken here. The columns that remain stand in silence, their temples gone, their gods forgotten, their purposes obscured by accumulated time. The stones remember what flesh forgets, remember the debates and declarations, the triumphs and tragedies, the slow accumulation of history that made this marsh become meeting place, the heart of an empire. The Forum breathes still, though differently now. Breathes the breath of tourists and archaeologists, of those who come to glimpse what was and imagine what might have been. The voices are gone, but the silence speaks. The crowds have dispersed, but the space remains, hollowed by absence, hallowed by memory. The marsh beneath, has never quite forgotten what it was. The water still rises in wet seasons, still claims the ground that human will once wrested from it. The forum, the heart, the center that held for 1,000 years and holds still in memory the first breath of Rome's civic life and the last exhalation before the long silence of centuries. From the gates of Rome, roads stretched outward like veins carrying the blood of empire to its furthest limbs. To the cold forests where Germanic warriors watched from shadows. To the sun-scorched sands where Egyptian temples stood, ancient before Rome was born. To the misty shores of Britannia where druids performed rituals that legions would suppress. The roads were Rome's nervous system, the means by which commands travelled from centre to periphery, and by which wealth flowed back to feed the capital's endless hunger. They were also Rome's most enduring monument, more lasting than temples, more useful than triumphal arches, still visible today across landscapes that have changed utterly since Roman feet last marched upon their stones. The Via Appia, the Appian Way, was first and greatest of Roman roads. Begun in 312 BCE by the censor Appius Claudius Caecus, the road ran southeast from Rome and toward Capua, was later extended to Brindisi on the Adriatic coast, covered 350 miles through terrain that included marshes, mountains, and the volcanic hills of Campania. The construction was massive undertaking, cutting through rock, bridging streams, draining wetlands, creating foundation layers of progressively smaller stones, topped with fitted basalt paving that would endure millennia of use. The road was wide enough for 2 carts to pass, was cambered to shed water toward ditches on either side, was marked by milestones that told travellers how far they had done and how far remained. Walking the Appian Way today, one still feels the Roman presence, the stones worn smooth by centuries of passage, the wheel ruts carved by countless carts, the tombs that line the roadside because Roman law forbade burial within city walls. The tombs were monuments to those who could afford them, cylindrical towers and temple-shaped mausoleums, carved reliefs depicting the deceased's achievements, inscriptions proclaiming names and deeds that the builders hoped would never be forgotten. Most are forgotten now. The names mean nothing to us. The achievements have faded into obscurity. But the tombs remain, and the road they border remains, testimony to Roman confidence that what they built would last. The network grew with the empire. The Via Flaminia climbed north through Apennine passes to Rimini on the Adriatic. The Via Aurelia followed the western coast toward Gaul. The Via Egnatia crossed from Adriatic to Aegean, connecting Rome to the Greek world it had conquered. In Gaul, Britain, Spain, North Africa, Asia Minor, Syria, wherever Roman power extended, roads followed, creating infrastructure that bound conquered peoples into the system, that made possible the movement of troops and goods and ideas that held the empire together. The roads were military necessity first and foremost. Roman legions needed to move quickly, needed to reach frontiers before barbarian incursions became invasions, needed to reinforce threatened positions, needed supply lines that could sustain armies far from Italy. A legion on good Roman road could march 20 miles per day, could reach distant provinces in weeks rather than months, could arrive at trouble spots before situations became desperate. The strategic advantage was immense. No previous empire had possessed such ability to project power across distance, to respond to threats with such speed, to maintain control over territories so vast. But the roads also enabled commerce. Merchants discovered that Roman roads were safer, faster, more reliable than any previous roads, were patrolled by soldiers, were maintained by the state, were protected by Roman law that punished brigandage severely. Good began to flow along the stone highways. Grain from Egypt and Africa to feed Rome's hungry million. Olive oil from Spain to light lamps and cook food. Wine from Gaul to satisfy Roman thirsts. Metals from Britain to arm Roman legions. Silk from China arriving via eastern trade routes. Spices from India and Arabia perfuming Roman tables. The trade enriched provinces and capital alike, created economic integration that gave subjects reason to value Roman rule. The roads carried ideas as powerfully as they carried goods. Christianity spread along Roman roads. Paul's missionary journeys followed Roman infrastructure. Early Christian communities formed in cities connected by Roman highways. The religion's rapid expansion was facilitated by the empire's transportation network. Mystery cults from Egypt and Persia, philosophical schools from Greece, religious innovations from every corner of the empire, all traveled Roman roads, all spread through the cosmopolitan cities that roads connected, all contributed to the cultural mixing that characterized Roman civilization. The engineering was sophisticated, was standardized, was applied consistently across the empire, so that a road in Britain resembled a road in Syria. The construction began with surveying. Roman surveyors were skilled at establishing straight routes across difficult terrain, at calculating gradients that would allow drainage without becoming too steep for loaded carts. Workers then excavated down to solid foundation, sometimes several feet deep in soft ground. Large stones were laid as base, smaller stones and gravel as middle layers, paving stones of basalt or other hard material as surface. The finished road was cambered, higher in the center than at the edges, to shed water toward drainage ditches. The construction was designed to endure, and it did. Many Roman roads remained in use for centuries after Roman power had vanished, remained the best roads in Europe until modern era. We travel specific roads, feeling the centuries beneath our feet. The Via Domitia across southern Gaul, first Roman road outside Italy, built to connect Italy to Spain, still traceable across the landscape. The Steingate and Hadrian's Wall road in Britain, marking the empire's northern limit, where soldiers patrolled watching for threats that eventually overwhelmed them. The Vanova Traiana in Arabia, built under Trajan to connect the Red Sea to Syria, facilitating trade that enriched both province and empire. Each road tells its story of conquest and connection, of the labor that built it and the purposes it served. The roads required constant maintenance. Stones shifted by frost heave, surfaces worn by traffic, bridges damaged by floods, all needed repair. Road maintenance was responsibility of local communities through which roads passed, was burden that some welcomed for the commerce roads brought, and others resented for the labor roads demanded. When empire weakened, when local communities could not or would not maintain roads, decline began. Grass grew through cracks in paving. Stones were carried away for other building. Bridges collapsed and were not rebuilt. The roads that had united the empire became fragments, because local paths, rather than imperial highways, lost their power to connect. We close this chapter on a road at twilight, somewhere in the former empire, perhaps in Italy, perhaps in Gaul, perhaps in the distant east, where Roman roads reached toward Persia. The road stretches forward and backward into darkness, leads somewhere that once mattered intensely, that drew travelers by thousands, that carried the traffic of a civilization. The stones remain, worn smooth by passages no living memory records. The milestones stand or have fallen, their numbers measuring distances that no longer seem relevant. The road leads to Rome, as all Roman roads were said to do, leads to Rome or to some provincial capital, leads to somewhere that was once center and is now periphery or ruin. The road spoke of power, spoke it in stone that endured when the power itself had vanished. They speak still to those who walk them, to those who trace their routes across maps, to those who understand that roads are more than routes, are statements of intention, are evidence of civilization's ability to reshape landscape according to its needs. The stone veins across the world, the arteries of empire, still visible, still traceable, still speaking of the power that built them and the silence that followed when the building stopped, on an island where mist never fully lifted, where the boundary between land and sea seemed negotiable with each tide, where the very ground felt temporary beneath your feet, as if it might dissolve back into ocean at any moment. There ruled a prince who never truly claimed his throne. He inherited a kingdom in chaos, a realm that had been prosperous once, but whose prosperity had been consumed by his father's wars. The old king had been ambitious, aggressive, convinced that expansion was the same as success, that each conquered territory added to his glory, even as it subtracted from his treasury, from his people's well-being, from the foundation of stability that any kingdom requires to flourish. The prince had watched his father's wars from the palace windows, had seen the soldiers march out with banners flying and weapons shining, had waited for their return with numbers diminished and eyes haunted. He had walked through halls where ministers argued about strategies and supplies, where maps were marked with territories won and lost, where the language was always of glory and victory, even when the reports detailed suffering and defeat. When his father died, not in battle, but in his bed, worn out by the effort of maintaining wars that had outlasted their purpose, the prince inherited not just a throne, but a catastrophe. Enemies at every border, some newly made by his father's aggression, others old rivals who saw the transition of power as opportunity for revenge or reclamation. Treasuries depleted, the gold spent on weapons and soldiers, and the infrastructure of warfare rather than the infrastructure of peace. A people exhausted, mourning their dead, questioning whether the territories won had been worth the sons lost in winning them. It was too much. The weight of it pressed down on the prince like a physical burden, making it difficult to breathe, to think, to imagine any action that might make things better rather than worse. So he did what seemed, at the time, like a reasonable solution to an impossible problem. He fled. Not physically. That would have been abandonment, would have sparked immediate crisis, would have made obvious what he preferred to keep hidden. Instead, he fled into fantasy, into a constructed world where the kingdom's problems could be observed without being felt, witnessed without being experienced, acknowledged without being addressed. He hired actors to perform courtly duties while he wandered disguised through his own streets, watching his kingdom crumble as though observing a play that did not concern him. The actors were professionals, skilled at their craft, capable of portraying the roles they were given with conviction that fooled all but the most careful observers. They dressed in the robes of ministers, studied the mannerisms of power, learned to move through the palace as if they belonged there, as if the authority they projected was real rather than performed. The principal actor, the one who portrayed the prince in official ceremonies, bore enough physical resemblance to make the deception plausible at a distance. With the right lighting, the right clothing, the right positioning that kept observers at a remove, he could pass. He sat on the throne during audiences, though he granted no actual decisions. He appeared at ceremonies, though he authorized nothing that would commit the kingdom to any particular course. He was, in essence, a placeholder, a symbol without substance, a crown worn by someone who had no right to its weight, but who carried it convincingly enough that most people never questioned whether the person beneath it was who they assumed. The other actors filled out the court, creating a complete tableau of governance. They sat in council chambers debating policies that would never be enacted, signing decrees that held no authority. They discussed the kingdom's problems with appropriate gravity, proposed solutions with suitable earnestness, created elaborate plans that looked official when written on parchment sealed with wax that bore the royal seal, a seal the prince had given them, along with his authority to use it for purposes that were purely theatrical. Meanwhile, the true business of state, the collection of taxes, the administration of justice, the defense of borders, dissolved into neglect. The structures of government continued to operate at lower levels. The mechanisms that had been established by previous rulers who took their duties seriously. But without direction from above, without coordination, without the authority to make decisions that required the prince's approval, the government became increasingly ineffective, increasingly unable to respond to problems that required unified action or difficult choices. Villagers appealed for help against bandits and received eloquent letters written by playwrights, beautiful compositions that expressed sympathy and promised action, but committed to nothing specific, authorized no troops, allocated no resources, simply acknowledged the problem in language so polished it almost disguised the fact that it offered no actual assistance. The letters were signed with the prince's signature, forged by the lead actor who had practiced until he could replicate it perfectly, and sealed with the royal seal, giving them every appearance of official authority while containing no substance behind that appearance. Cities requested grain during famine and received poems describing abundant harvests that existed only in imagination. The poems were genuinely beautiful. The playwrights the prince had hired were talented, capable of creating verses that painted pictures of granaries overflowing, of fields golden with wheat, of bread so plentiful it could be shared freely with anyone who hungered. The poems described a kingdom that existed nowhere except in the lyrical language that conjured it, a realm of plenty that mocked the reality of scarcity it was sent to address. The prince himself walked among his people wearing the clothes of a merchant, a fisherman, a beggar. He had different costumes for different districts, different personas for different audiences, different names that he gave when asked. Though he often chose to say nothing, to let people assume whatever they would about the stranger who appeared and disappeared without explanation. He listened to his people's complaints about their ruler, stood in taverns while men drunk enough to forget caution spoke freely about the prince's uselessness, his absence, his failure to address the problems that grew more urgent with each season that passed without action. The prince nodded sympathetically, agreed that yes, the prince was indeed neglectful, absent, lost in whatever concerns occupied him while his people suffered. Sometimes, caught in the moment, he added his own criticisms, elaborating on the prince's failings with an insider's knowledge that made his condemnation particularly cutting. Sometimes he wept at their suffering. Late at night, alone in whatever room he had rented, under whatever false name he was using, he would lie awake, thinking of the stories he had heard, the children going hungry, the elderly being robbed by bandits who faced no consequence, the merchants struggling under taxes that went uncollected in some districts while being harshly enforced in others, creating an arbitrary unfairness that bred resentment and division. The tears were real. The sorrow was genuine. The wish that things could be different, that he could somehow make them better, was sincere. But sincerity without action is indulgence. Emotion without responsibility is performance. And the prince performed his own suffering as thoroughly as the actors in his palace performed governance, with the key difference being that his performance had no audience but himself, no purpose but the temporary relief of allowing feeling without the burden of doing. Sometimes he bought people drinks and listened to their stories deep into the night, hearing about their lives with an attention that would have served him well if he had applied it to actual governance, if he had taken what he learned in these midnight conversations and transformed it into policy, into action, into the work of ruling that he had hired others to pretend to do, while he pretended to be someone other than himself. But always, come morning, he returned to his palace, removed his disguise, and became again the prince who could not bear the weight of the crown he wore only in private, in mirrors that reflected a truth he visited but never inhabited. The transition from commoner costume to royal robes felt like shedding one skin for another, each one somehow false. each one a performance of an identity he never quite managed to fully occupy. The kingdom learned to govern itself, village by village, forming councils of necessity. In the absence of effective central authority, local structures emerged to fill the void. Village elders, who had once deferred to the prince's ministers, found themselves making decisions that affected their community's survival. Merchants, who had once waited for royal charters, created their own agreements about trade and fair dealing. Farmers, who had once looked to the crown for protection from bandits, hired their own guards, pooling resources to create security that the state no longer provided. They created laws in the absence of royal decree, settled disputes through elder wisdom rather than courtly judgment, organized defense when no army came to their aid. The laws were simpler than the formal codes that had existed before, more directly connected to the problems they addressed, more flexible in their application because they were created by people who understood context, who knew the individuals involved, who could craft solutions that fit circumstances rather than applying rigid rules that might not account for nuance. They became inadvertently free, though they still paid taxes to a throne that gave nothing in return. The taxes were collected by functionaries who operated on precedent and habit, who continued to gather revenue because that was the system that existed, that had existed for generations, that no one had explicitly ordered to stop, even though no one was actively directing it to continue. The money flowed into treasuries where it sat unused, accumulating while the kingdom it was meant to serve struggled to meet needs that gold could address if anyone with authority to spend it cared enough to do so. They still bowed to a crown that had become purely ornamental, a relic of a contract broken by the very man who should have honored it. When the actor who played the prince appeared at ceremonies, the people bowed because that was custom, because open resistance would bring consequences they couldn't afford, because it was easier to maintain the fiction than to confront the reality that their prince had abdicated everything but the title, had kept the crown while abandoning the responsibility that gave it meaning. And the prince wandered on, a ghost haunting his own reign, present and absent, ruler and refugee from his own responsibility. Years passed, the actors aged, had to be replaced with new performers who learned the roles from their predecessors. The prince himself aged, his disguises requiring more effort as his face became known despite his attempts to remain unknown, as his distinctive way of moving or speaking betrayed him to observers more perceptive than he credited. He told himself he was learning, that his time among the people was valuable, that he was gathering understanding that would someday inform better governance. But someday never came. The knowledge accumulated without application. The understanding deepened without transformation into action. The experience enriched him personally while doing nothing for the people whose suffering had provided it. The kingdom survived despite him rather than because of him. Resilience rooted not in royal leadership, but in the basic human capacity to adapt, to organize, to create order from chaos when necessity demands it. The people who had learned to govern themselves did so with increasing competence. developing systems that worked better in some ways than the centralized authority that had failed them. Discovering that solutions crafted locally by people who understood local problems often fit better than edicts issued from distant palaces by rulers who saw their subjects as abstract concerns rather than specific individuals. When the prince eventually died, not young, having lived a long life of observation without participation, the transition of power barely registered. The actor who had been playing him was retired with a pension. A cousin was crowned in a ceremony, attended by people who bowed out of habit more than conviction. The new ruler found a kingdom that had learned to function without effective central authority, a realm that had adapted to neglect by developing self-sufficiency. A people who had discovered they could survive without the protection they had once believed only a king could provide. And in the records, in the official histories written by chroniclers who were themselves part of the apparatus of pretend governance, the prince was remembered as a mysterious figure, a ruler who moved among his people in disguise, who understood them as few kings ever had. The history made his evasion sound like wisdom, his absence like presence by other means, his failure to lead like a different kind of leadership, more subtle, more in touch with the common experience. But the people remembered differently. They remembered a prince who cared enough to cry but not enough to act, who felt their pain but would not bear the burden of alleviating it, who knew their problems intimately but refused to use his power to address them. They remembered, and they taught their children, preserving a truth more accurate than the official history. That empathy without action is indulgence, that understanding without application is cowardice, that a crown unworn might as well not exist, that a throne unoccupied becomes a symbol of absence rather than authority, that a prince who could not bear the weight of responsibility should have set down the crown rather than keeping it, while fleeing everything it demanded of him, in a realm where cherry blossoms marked the passage of seasons, where calligraphy transformed thought into sacred art, where every gesture carried weight and meaning accumulated over centuries of refinement. There ruled an empress who could not accept the truth written in every falling petal, that beauty fades, that youth departs, that time shows mercy to no throne, no matter how elevated or adorned. She had been beautiful once, genuinely, extraordinarily beautiful in ways that inspired poets and painters, that made ordinary conversation pause when she entered rooms, that seemed almost supernatural in its perfection of proportion and grace. Her beauty had been noted from childhood, praised and cultivated, transformed into her primary identity, the quality that defined her above intelligence or kindness or strength or any other attribute a person might possess. When she ascended to the throne, through complicated succession politics that involved the death of brothers and the strategic marriage and divorce of a father who cycled through wives seeking male heirs, her beauty became part of the imperial mystique, proof of heaven's favor, evidence that she was meant to rule. Portraits commissioned during her early reign show a woman of such remarkable appearance that even accounting for artistic flattery, something exceptional must have existed beneath the paint. But time, that great democrat, grants beauty to no one permanently. The Empress was perhaps 30 when she first noticed the subtle changes. A line at the corner of her eye that had not been there the season before. A quality to her skin that seemed fractionally less luminous. A tone to her reflection that suggested the beginning of what would become, if left to natural course, the ordinary aging that every human body undergoes. For most people, these changes arrive gradually enough to accommodate, to integrate into identity, to accept as part of the journey from youth to maturity to age. But the Empress's entire sense of self, her understanding of her value, her belief in her right to rule, all of it was tangled inseparably with her appearance, with the beauty that had defined her since before she could remember being anything else. So she could not accept it, would not accept it. Instead, she gathered alchemists from across the known world, promising them fortunes for formulas to halt the sun's advance across her skin, to freeze the mirror's reflection at the moment of her perfection. The alchemists came from distant lands, bringing with them knowledge accumulated over lifetimes of study. They came from desert kingdoms where preservation of the dead had been perfected to the point that bodies could remain unchanged for millennia. They came from mountain monasteries where monks had dedicated centuries to understanding the relationship between body and spirit, seeking ways to purify the flesh or transcend its limitations. They came from island nations where rare plants grew that were said to extend life, to heal wounds, to restore vitality to the aged. They set up laboratories in palace wings, filling rooms with apparatus and ingredients, with bubbling retorts and careful measurements, with substances distilled and combined and tested on animals first, then on prisoners who had little choice but to volunteer, then on servants who were promised rewards they would rarely receive. The experiments proceeded with the methodical patience of science applied to an impossible goal, seeking through rational means to achieve what nature had not designed to be achieved. Her quest consumed the empire's wealth like fire consumes parchment. The alchemists' fees were substantial, paid in gold that represented taxes collected from provinces already struggling. But beyond their fees, the ingredients they required were often rare, exotic, expensive beyond reason. Rare herbs were harvested to extinction. Entire species of plants that had taken millennia to evolve were consumed in experiments that sought to extract whatever properties they might possess that could slow or reverse aging. Minerals were mined from sacred mountains until the peaks themselves grew hollow, collapsing into valleys that had once bloomed with life. Mountains that had been revered for generations, that had been considered homes of gods or spirits, were excavated for rare earths, for compounds that existed only in specific geological formations, for crystals that the alchemists believed might hold some essential quality of permanence, some resistance to change that could be transferred to human flesh. She bathed in milk stolen from mothers whose infants cried from hunger. The milk baths were recommended by alchemists who believed that the properties that nourished infants might also preserve skin, might transfer some quality of new life to aging flesh. Servants collected milk from women across the empire. Women who were paid for their milk, but whose children suffered from the diversion of nourishment meant for them. The empress bathed in enormous tubs filled with milk that quickly soured in the heat, requiring constant replenishment, consuming daily what could have fed families for weeks. She wore masks of gold dust and crushed pearls, while her subjects wore rags thin as spider silk, praying for winters they could survive. The masks were applied each night, compounds mixed fresh by attendants who had been trained in their application, who spread the precious materials across the empress's skin in layers that were meant to nourish, to tighten, to preserve. The gold was real, ground to dust fine enough to pass through silk, mixed with pearl powder, created by crushing pearls that could have paid for disaster relief, for food stores, for any of the 1,000 needs that an empire always has, but which went unmet while resources flowed toward preserving the empress's appearance. The palace became a shrine to stillness. Clocks were banned, for they marked time's passage, the ticking a constant reminder of the force she could not stop. The mechanical clocks that had been imported from distant lands, marvels of engineering that kept time with precision unknown to water clocks or sundials, were removed and destroyed. The absence of clocks made time in the palace feel strange, unmoored, with no regular marking of hours, days bleeding into each other in ways that made servants forget how long they had worked, when they had last rested, whether morning had passed to afternoon or afternoon into evening. Mirrors were permitted only after court artists perfected each one's reflection, ensuring flattering light and angles that defied honesty. The mirror makers developed techniques that incorporated subtle distortions into the glass, curves that stretched and flattered, that took years from reflected faces, that showed the empress not as she was, but as she wished to be. The process of creating these mirrors was complex, requiring grinding and polishing to specifications so precise that most mirrors failed inspection and had to be destroyed. Their fragments buried where they could not reflect truth that the empress had forbidden to exist in her presence. Her courtiers learned to age in secret, hiding grey hairs beneath elaborate wigs, painting youth onto faces that time had touched. To appear old in her presence was to remind her of the war she could not win, and such reminders often proved fatal to those careless enough to embody them. Not fatal literally, she did not execute courtiers for aging, but fatal to careers, to positions at court, to the access to power and influence that required remaining in the empress's favor. So the court became a strange place where everyone performed youth, regardless of their actual age, where 70-year-old ministers wore makeup and padding to suggest vitality they did not feel, where grey hair was cause for panicked overnight dying, where wrinkles meant banishment, or at least removal from positions that required proximity to the empress. The courtiers became actors in a play about a place that did not age, performing roles in a fantasy that everyone knew was false, but that no one could afford to acknowledge. In the gardens, she commissioned, sculptors carved statues of her younger self, each one perfect, unchanging, a lie told in marble and bronze. The gardens sprawled across acres that had once grown food, transformed into a gallery of the empress at different ages of her youth. each statue capturing her at a specific moment that she deemed worth preserving. Empress at 17, frozen in marble that would outlast memory. Empress at 22, cast in bronze that would corrode over centuries, but slowly enough that generations would see her as she saw herself. Eternally young, eternally beautiful, eternally at the peak of perfection that flesh could achieve. She walked among these frozen versions of herself as decades passed, her reflection fragmenting across a gallery of impossibilities. The walks became ritual, a daily pilgrimage through a landscape that presented her as she wished to be, rather than as she was becoming. She would pause before each statue, comparing her actual reflection in the polished surfaces to the idealized version rendered in stone, measuring the distance between reality and preservation, feeling that distance widen with each passing year, despite all the treatments, all the potions, all the desperate attempts to stop what could not be stopped. The people noticed the statues never changed, while their empress, despite all her arts and potions, grew brittle as autumn leaves. They were not permitted to speak this observation aloud, but they noticed nonetheless. They saw her at ceremonies, at formal appearances, where she sat elevated and distant, but still visible. And they saw what the flattering lights and careful positioning could not fully disguise. That time was winning the war she waged against it. That the treatments and potions were losing their efficacy, or had never had efficacy except in her mind. That the face on the throne grew yearly more distant from the faces frozen in marble throughout the gardens. They noticed and said nothing, for the truth had become the most dangerous contraband in an empire where the greatest crime was acknowledging that even empresses must someday bow to the same force that bends every blade of grass, every star, every stone toward its eventual rest. Servants who cleaned the empress's chambers saw in the morning light what carefully maintained evening illumination concealed. Attendants who dressed her felt beneath silk robes the body that was aging, despite everything money and desperation could do to prevent it. But they maintained the fiction, performed their parts in the collective pretense, because to do otherwise was to risk consequences that went beyond personal punishment to threatening the entire elaborate structure of denial that the Empress had built around herself. The alchemists, for their part, continued their work with decreasing confidence. The most honest among them knew they were seeking what could not be found, knew that aging was not a disease to be cured, but a process woven into the fabric of organic life, knew that the Empress's quest was doomed by its basic misunderstanding of what humans are and how flesh functions. But they continued because stopping meant admitting failure, meant confessing that they had taken her gold and given her nothing but false hope, meant facing her disappointment, which, even more than her anger, was something they found they could not bear to witness. Some of them began to believe their own fabrications, convincing themselves that the next formula would work where previous ones had failed, that some combination of ingredients not yet tried would unlock the secret that had eluded every generation before them. Others simply learned to lie convincingly, to describe subtle improvements that existed nowhere except in descriptions. to attribute to their potions effects that were indistinguishable from placebo, or from the normal variation in how a face appears at different times and in different lights. The empire suffered from the diversion of resources, but not catastrophically. The structure of government was robust enough to function even when the Empress's attention was focused almost entirely on her appearance rather than on administration. Ministers governed, taxes were collected, infrastructure was maintained, all the mechanisms of state continuing to operate largely independent of the person who sat at its nominal center. The empire was wealthy enough that the waste, though substantial, did not immediately cause collapse. But there was opportunity cost. The good that could have been done with resources instead devoted to impossible quests, the schools that could have been built, the roads repaired, the suffering alleviated, all the positive acts that never happened because the gold was spent elsewhere. As she aged, and she did age despite everything, the Empress withdrew. Public appearances became rare, then occasional, then almost mythical. She ruled increasingly through intermediaries, through written decrees that carried her seal, but that might have been written by ministers who had learned to anticipate her wishes, or who simply made policy in her name, knowing she was too absorbed in her private war against time to notice or care. The palace filled with mirrors that lied, and courtiers who performed, and gardens filled with statues that showed what was lost rather than what remained. And at the center of this elaborate construction sat an empress who had become a prisoner of her own fear, trapped in chambers where every surface was controlled to show her only what she wished to see, surrounded by people who dared not speak truth, spending her remaining years fighting a war that could never be won, that was lost from the moment she decided winning was necessary, that transformed what could have been dignified maturity into desperate grasping after something that existed only in memory and marble, preserved everywhere except in the one place it mattered most. In the living flesh, that time, patient and inexorable, continued to move through its ordained passage from youth to age to whatever lies beyond, carrying the Empress with it despite her protests, despite her potions, despite her refusal to accept what every human body knows in its bones, that we are temporary, that beauty fades, that fighting this truth only makes its victory more complete when it finally, inevitably arrives in valleys where fog settled, thick as memory, where even summer felt like autumn's echo, where the sun appeared more as rumor than reality through layers of mist that never fully burned away. There ruled a king fascinated by absence, by what remained when light departed, by the negative spaces that defined form more surely than form itself. His obsession began innocently, a childhood fear of shadows that transformed into curiosity, then fixation, finally madness wrapped in intellectual pursuit. As a young prince, he had been afraid of the dark, terrified of the shapes that appeared on walls when candles flickered, convinced that the shadows cast by ordinary objects were somehow more real than the objects themselves, that darkness held truths that light obscured. His tutors, trying to cure him of this fear, had taught him about optics, about how shadows were merely the absence of light, geometric projections with no substance or independent existence. But the lessons had the opposite effect. Instead of diminishing his fear, they deepened his fascination. If shadows were absences, he reasoned, then they were spaces where something could exist that light made impossible to see. If darkness was merely light's opposite, then perhaps it held properties inverse to light's properties, realities that could only be perceived when illumination was removed. When he became king, he had resources to pursue this fascination beyond childhood wondering. He commissioned scholars to study darkness, philosophers to contemplate void, artists to paint what could not be seen. The scholars came from universities where they had studied optics and astronomy, where they understood light mathematically and could describe darkness as its absence with precision. But the king wanted more. He wanted them to study darkness on its own terms, not merely as light's opposite, but as a phenomenon worthy of investigation independent of what it was not. The philosophers he gathered were men who had spent careers contemplating nothingness, void, the spaces between things, the pauses between heartbeats, the silence between notes that gives music its meaning. They debated in chambers lit by single candles, discussing whether darkness was truly absence or whether it possessed its own existence, whether void was empty or full of things humans lacked the senses to perceive, whether nothing was truly nothing or merely something we had not learned to recognize. The artists faced the greatest challenge: how to paint what could not be seen, how to represent absence on canvas, how to make visible the invisible. Some painted canvases entirely black, claiming that true representation of darkness required abandoning the pretense of depicting what darkness contained. Others painted gradations of grey, attempting to capture the subtle variations within darkness that the eye learns to distinguish when light is removed. Still others painted negative images, showing what surrounded darkness in order to define darkness by its edges, by what it was not rather than what it was. He ordered the construction of chambers within chambers, rooms designed to capture and contain shadow, as others might cage birds. His architects were at first confused by the commission. How does one contain what has no substance, what exists only as absence? But the king's goal was persuasive, and they began to design spaces that would maximize darkness, that would create pockets of shadow so deep that the most powerful lights could not penetrate them. The palace grew inward, becoming a labyrinth where corridors twisted upon themselves, creating pockets of darkness that persisted even at noon. The construction was architectural innovation pressed into service of obsession. Halls that turned back on themselves to block light from windows. Staircase that descended to levels below levels. Chambers whose walls were painted in blacks, so absolute they seemed to absorb rather than reflect. Creating spaces where the eye could find no purchase, where even adjusting to darkness revealed nothing, because there was nothing to reveal except darkness itself. Courtiers lost their way in corridors they had walked 100 times, the familiar made strange by shadows that shifted with the building's expansion, by new passages that opened without warning, by old routes that ended in walls that had not been there the day before. Time became uncertain in the depths of the palace. where the absence of natural light made it impossible to judge whether hours had passed or merely minutes, where the usual markers of day and night disappeared beneath layers of architectural darkness. The king spent his nights in the deepest chambers, sitting in absolute darkness, listening to what he claimed were voices that only spoke when light was fully banished. What he heard in those sessions, he never fully disclosed. He would emerge from hours or days in the dark chambers, his sense of time as unreliable as anyone's in that place, and issue decrees based on insights he claimed the darkness had revealed. He issued commands that windows be shrouded, that lanterns be dimmed, that his kingdom embrace the shade he believed held hidden wisdom. The decrees went out to provinces that had always lived under normal cycles of day and night, that had never questioned the value of sunlight or feared the natural darkness of evening. But the king's will was law, and so the shrouding began. Markets operated in perpetual twilight, their goods displayed under lighting dim enough to make colours uncertain, qualities difficult to judge, transactions complicated by the inability to clearly see what was being bought or sold. Merchants complained that business suffered when customers could not properly examine merchandise. But the complaints were answered with reminders that the king's wisdom exceeded merchants' understanding, that what seemed like impediment was actually invitation to develop new ways of knowing, to trust senses other than sight, to embrace darkness as the king had embraced it. Children grew up never knowing the full brightness of day. Windows in schools, those that remained open, were covered with cloth that filtered sunlight to dimness, creating interiors where reading required squinting, where playing required caution to avoid collisions, where the exuberance natural to childhood was muted by conditions that made running and shouting seem dangerously reckless. The sun became a distant memory, something grandparents spoke of, like a legend from an age now past. The old ones remembered mornings when light streamed golden through windows, afternoons when heat made rest necessary, evenings when sunset painted the sky in colors that had no names, because language had not needed to capture gradations of light in a world where light was abundant and varied. They remembered and tried to describe to grandchildren, who listened with the polite incomprehension of people hearing about a world they had never experienced and could not quite imagine. His subjects developed pale skin that bruised easily, eyes that could see in near darkness, but squinted painfully in ordinary light. The adaptation happened over years, over generations born into dimness who knew no other way of living. Their bodies changed, becoming suited to the environment the king had created. Skin losing pigmentation it no longer needed for protection from sun it rarely encountered. Eyes developing enhanced sensitivity to minimal light, while losing the ability to tolerate brightness without discomfort. They moved through their shadowed world quietly, speaking in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the darkness their king had made sacred. The quiet was partly reverence for the king's obsession, partly practical adaptation to an environment where sound traveled strangely in the absence of light, where voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, where the usual visual cues that help humans locate sound sources were absent, making conversation disorienting when conducted at normal volume. And in the hidden places, in rooms where a few brave souls kept lanterns burning behind heavy curtains that concealed their light from external observation, they told stories of sunlight, of colors bright and warm, of a world they could barely remember but refused to completely forget. These keepers of light met in secret, knowing discovery would mean punishment, knowing their resistance to the king's darkness was treason against his vision. They maintained forbidden knowledge: how to keep lamps burning cleanly, how to create dye-tells that would reveal their true colors when light eventually returned, how to grow plants that required more than the dim filtered light that penetrated the kingdom's shrouded windows. They grew pale flowers in hidden gardens, lit by lanterns, keeping alive species that would have died in the perpetual twilight that covered the rest of the kingdom. They taught children in whispers about the sun, about how light revealed rather than obscured, about warmth that came from above rather than from fires that burned in hearths. They taught even though teaching was dangerous, even though discovery meant consequences, because they believed that knowledge of light must be preserved for a time, when darkness would no longer be mandatory, when windows could be unveiled, when the kingdom might remember what had been lost in the king's descent into shadow. The king grew old in his darkness, his eyes becoming so attuned to shadow that the smallest light, a candle in a distant room, a crack in curtains admitting a sliver of sun, would cause him pain that felt like needles driven into his skull. His court physicians could do nothing except prescribe darker chambers, thicker curtains, more complete isolation from anything that might remind him that the world beyond his palace still contained light. He became a creature of pure darkness, living in chambers where servants moved by touch rather than sight, where food was brought on silent feet and left where he could find it by familiar placement rather than by seeing. He claimed the darkness revealed truths that light had always hidden, that he could see now more clearly than when his eyes had functioned normally, that what others called blindness he understood as vision of a different kind, perception of realities that required darkness to make themselves known. Whether this was wisdom or madness, insight or delusion, no one could say with certainty. The king spoke of patterns he perceived in darkness, of structures that had no form but somehow had existence, of presences that communicated not through sound or light, but through some direct contact with consciousness that required all other inputs to be eliminated before it could be perceived. His pronouncements from the depths became increasingly strange, less connected to the practical concerns of governing, more focused on abstract observations about the nature of void and absence and the spaces between things. His ministers learned to interpret these pronouncements creatively, to extract from mystical observations whatever practical guidance they could, or to simply govern according to their own judgment, while claiming their decisions reflected the king's dark wisdom. When he died, he was found in his deepest chamber, sitting in a chair carved from black stone, his sightless eyes open, his face bearing an expression that might have been peace or terror. In darkness, Even those who found him could not be certain which. His body was so pale, it seemed translucent, as if the years of darkness had begun to make him transparent, to transform him into the absence he had spent his life studying. His burial was strange. A tomb built without windows, without light of any kind, sealed so completely that no illumination could ever penetrate its darkness. The tomb was exactly what he would have wanted. A monument to shadow, a space of permanent darkness that would portray his body in the condition he had preferred in life. Unseen, unseeable, existing in darkness so complete that even memory of light could not survive within it. And slowly, tentatively, light returned to the kingdom. The new ruler, a niece who had spent her childhood in provinces distant enough from the capital to avoid the worst of the shrouding, ordered curtains removed, windows unveiled, lanterns lit at full brightness. The process was gradual, allowing people to adjust, to relearn how to live with light after years or generations in dimness. The transition was painful for some. Those whose eyes had adapted too completely to darkness found full light agonizing, had to relearn how to function in brightness or continue living in dimmed rooms they created for themselves, choosing voluntarily what had once been imposed. But most welcomed the return, remembered or learned for the first time what colors looked like in proper light, what the world revealed when shadow was natural rather than mandatory, when darkness was night's gift rather than the king's obsession inflicted on waking hours. The secret keepers emerged, bringing with them the flowers they had preserved, the knowledge they had protected, the memory of light that had allowed the kingdom to remember what had been lost and to recognize, when it returned, what they had been missing. Their gardens bloomed in full sun for the first time in decades. Their colors so vivid they seemed almost violent after years of muted tones. Their beauty a testimony to persistence, to the refusal to let darkness claim everything, to the stubborn insistence that light had value, even when a king declared that shadow was superior. The palace itself remained, its labyrinthine chambers, a monument to one man's obsession, an architectural manifestation of the path that leads from fear to fascination, to fixation, to the kind of madness that believes its own distortions are insights, its own limitations are enhancements, its own darkness is light of a different kind. The deepest chambers were sealed, too dangerous to navigate, too strange to repurpose, left as tombs for an obsession that had consumed a king and nearly consumed a kingdom. A reminder carved in stone and shadow of what happens when rulers confuse their personal obsessions with truth, their private visions with public good, their descent into darkness with a path that others should be forced to follow, into depths that reveal nothing except the danger of believing that absence is presence, that void is fullness, that shadow is anything other than what it has always been, the space where light is not, waiting patiently for illumination to return and reveal what was hidden, what remained, what survived the years of imposed darkness. Because some things persist even in shadow. Some truths survive even when kings forbid their speaking. Some light continues to exist even when obscured, waiting for the moment when curtains are pulled back and windows opened, and the kingdom remembers how to live in brightness rather than shade. Across deserts where heat made the horizon shimmer with false water, where caravans had traded since before cities knew walls, where the very air seemed to carry weight in the stillness between wind and wind, there ruled a sultan who believed in absolute justice, a precision so perfect it became cruelty's sharpest instrument. He had come to power in the aftermath of chaos, during a period when law had collapsed and disputes were settled through violence, when the strong took what they wanted and the weak suffered without recourse, when justice was whatever those with power declared it to be. The Sultan had witnessed this chaos, had suffered under it, had seen his own family destroyed by lawlessness that masqueraded as freedom, by injustice that claimed to be natural order. His response was understandable. To create a system so perfectly balanced that injustice would become impossible. To establish justice so absolute that no one could twist it to their advantage. To build a legal framework so precisely calibrated that fairness would be guaranteed through mathematics, rather than left to the unreliable judgments of fallible humans. He commissioned a great scale, built from materials gathered across his empire. Gold from western mountains, silver from eastern mines, brass from southern forges, all calibrated with such exactness that it could measure a feather's weight against wind. The scale was an engineering marvel, a mechanism of such precision that its creation required craftsmen to develop new techniques, to achieve tolerances that exceeded anything previously attempted, to create an instrument that could detect differences in weight so subtle that human senses could not perceive them. This scale became the center of his court, the arbiter of all disputes. He decreed that justice must be mathematically perfect, that every crime required punishment measured with absolute equivalence, that mercy itself was a form of corruption, an imbalance in the cosmic order he imagined himself maintaining. The logic seemed sound. If justice means giving each person what they deserve, then precise measurement of desert would create perfect justice. If crime caused harm, then punishments that exactly balance that harm would restore order. If the law was applied equally to all, measured with identical precision, regardless of rank or wealth or relationship, then the system would be fair in ways that human judgment, always influenced by bias and emotion, could never achieve. But the translation of this logic into practice created horrors that the Sultan, committed to his system, refused to recognize as problems. Thieves lost hands that weighed precisely what they had stolen. The equation seemed balanced. Property taken, property returned, with the thief's hand substituted for whatever object had been stolen. The scale determined the weight. A hand heavier than the stolen object would be trimmed, fingers removed one by one until the weight matched exactly. A hand lighter than the stolen object meant the thief's punishment was insufficient, requiring additional payment in other body parts, other measurements of flesh, until balance was achieved. The surgeons who performed these amputations worked with scales beside their tables, weighing removed parts against samples that represented the stolen property, making adjustments to achieve perfect balance. They became experts in anatomy, knowing which joints to cut to achieve which weights, which bones contained more mass than others, which parts could be removed while leaving the victim alive, because death would unbalance the equation, would prevent the thief from making full restitution, would cheat justice of its mathematical precision. Debtors labored for days calculated to the minute of what they owed. Complex formula determined the value of a day's labor, adjusted for the type of work, the skill required, the productivity of the individual debtor. The calculations grew baroque in their complexity. A strong young man's day of labor might pay more debt than an old woman's, but if the old woman possessed the skills the young man lacked, her work might be valued higher despite her lower physical capacity. The debtors worked under supervision of timekeepers who measured their labor in increments so small that breaks for rest or food had to be calculated and added to the total time owed. A meal break of 20 minutes might extend the servitude by 20 minutes. A moment of fatigue that reduced productivity might require additional time to compensate for the decreased value of labor delivered during that moment. Even children who lied faced punishments calibrated to the weight of their falsehoods, measured in tears they were required to shed. The system for measuring tears was particularly bizarre. Children were held before the scale and made to cry. Their tears collected in vessels, whose weight was checked against the estimated weight of harm their lie had caused. How does one measure the weight of a lie? The Sultan's philosophers developed elaborate formulas, considering the importance of the truth obscured, the damage caused by the deception, the relationship between liar and deceived, all translated into weights that could be placed on the scale's pan and balanced against tears. Children learn to cry on command, to produce tears in the quantity required to satisfy justice, to understand that spontaneous tears of genuine remorse carried the same weight as forced tears of compliance, that the Sultan's system cared only for measurement, not for the internal states that might make punishment meaningful versus merely painful. The Sultan sat daily beside his scale, watching as his subjects' lives were reduced to measurements, to weights and counterweights, to an arithmetic of suffering he called righteousness. His throne was positioned directly next to the scale, allowing him to observe each case, to verify that his ministers were applying the system correctly, to ensure that justice maintained its mathematical purity. He watched with satisfaction as the scale balanced, as debts were paid in precisely measured increments, as crimes were answered with punishments of exact equivalence. He saw perfection where others saw horror, saw justice where others saw cruelty mechanized, saw a system functioning as designed where others saw humanity reduced to calculations that missed everything that made humans human. Context, intention, circumstance, the thousand factors that make two seemingly identical acts different in ways that matter even if they cannot be weighed. His ministers kept ledgers of staggering complexity, recording every gram, every grain, every fractional unit of retribution dispensed. The ledgers filled rooms, stacked from floor to ceiling, each one documenting cases resolved through measurement, lives altered through calculation, justice dispensed through arithmetic that grew more elaborate with each passing year. The palace scribes developed new symbols to express the mathematics of justice, creating equations that balanced crime against punishment with such precision that human beings became merely variables in formulas etched on endless scrolls. The symbols multiplied as cases revealed complexities the original system had not anticipated. How to measure crimes against a reputation, how to weigh emotional harm, how to calculate punishment for accidents versus intention. All translated into mathematical notation that became its own language, understood fully only by specialists trained in the Sultan's juridical arithmetic. Yet the scale itself began to fail. Perhaps the constant weighing wore upon its mechanisms. The brass and gold and silver subjected to stresses they were not designed to endure indefinitely. Perhaps the weight of so much calculated suffering proved too heavy, even for instruments crafted with such care. Perhaps there was some quality to its use that the craftsman had not anticipated. Some way that measuring humanity degraded the instrument doing the measuring. It began giving inconsistent readings, trembling when it should have been still, balancing when it should have tipped. A weight placed on one pan would register differently than it had the day before. The same object, measured multiple times, would yield different results. The precision the system required was being undermined by the very instrument that was meant to guarantee it. The Sultan, confronted with his instrument's imperfection, could not accept that his system might be flawed. The scale was not wrong. It could not be wrong because if it was wrong, then every judgment rendered using it was questionable. Every punishment potentially unjust. The entire edifice of perfect justice revealed as built on a foundation that was less reliable than the human judgment it was meant to replace. So he ordered new scales built, larger, more precise, constructed with even greater care and even more expensive materials. Each new scale was an improvement over the last in theory, incorporating refinements meant to eliminate the errors that had plagued previous versions, adding mechanisms to compensate for temperature and humidity, and all the environmental factors that might affect weight, creating instruments so complex they required teams of specialists just to operate and maintain. And the cycle continued. Justice pursued with such relentless accuracy that it ceased being justice at all, becoming instead a grinding mechanism that reduced human complexity to numbers, compassion to calculation, wisdom to weight, measured on instruments that grew less reliable the more desperately the Sultan needed them to be perfect. The people learned to fear the scale more than crime itself. Better to suffer theft than to report it and watch the thief lose hands measured against property. Better to forgive debt than to send a debtor to labor measured in minutes. Better to accept a child's lie than to see that child forced to cry until tears reached the required weight. The scale, meant to guarantee justice, became instead an instrument that discouraged its pursuit, that made people prefer to handle disputes privately rather than submit them to a system that reduced human problems to mechanical measurements. Commerce suffered as people avoided formal contracts that might be enforced through the scale's justice. Trust became impossible when any debt, any disagreement, any accusation might be resolved through calculations that ignored context, that measured result without considering cause, that balanced harm without asking whether balance itself was the appropriate response. The Sultan died without heirs. He had never married, never formed the relationships that require the kind of flexibility and forgiveness and acceptance of imprecision that his system had trained him to reject. He died alone, attended only by servants who were there because they were paid, who performed their duties because their labor time was measured and compensated, who felt nothing for the man beside the scale because feeling, unmeasurable and unbalanced, had no place in the world he had created. His successor ordered the great scale dismantled, its precious metals melted and repurposed, its mechanisms destroyed so thoroughly that no one could resurrect the system it represented. The new Sultan established courts that relied on human judges, imperfect and sometimes biased, but capable of considering context, capable of mercy, capable of recognizing that justice is not arithmetic, that fairness cannot be weighed, that some truths are too complex to measure. The people remembered the scale as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when the pursuit of perfection becomes divorced from the messy reality of human existence. When justice becomes confused with precision, when the desire to eliminate unfairness leads to the creation of a different kind of unfairness, one that treats humans as objects, that reduces life to calculation, that measures everything except what matters most. And in the archives, in the ledgers that filled rooms, there remained a record of the scale's justice, thousands of cases resolved with mathematical precision, thousands of punishments calibrated to the gram, thousands of lives altered through measurements that captured weight but missed meaning, that achieved balance but sacrificed wisdom, that created a kind of fairness so perfect it was indistinguishable from cruelty, so precise it had no room for the imprecision that makes us human, so absolute it became absolutely wrong in ways the Sultan, devoted to his system, never permitted himself to see. In a kingdom where rivers ran through cities ancient, when Rome was young, where art adorned every surface and beauty was worshipped like a deity, where aesthetics determined value and appearance became indistinguishable from truth. There ruled a king who understood that truth could be ugly, that reality often disappointed, that people preferred lovely falsehoods to harsh facts. He had not always been a liar. In his youth, he had valued honesty, had believed that truth was sacred, that reality, however difficult, should be confronted rather than evaded. But reality had been unkind to him. His appearance was ordinary, his talents unremarkable, his prospects limited by birth order that placed him far from succession, unlikely ever to rule, unless catastrophe eliminated every candidate between himself and the throne. And then catastrophe came. Plague swept through the royal family with the cruel randomness that disease sometimes displays, taking strong and weak alike, killing with no regard for virtue or vice. eliminating in months what would have taken generations of normal succession to achieve. When the dying ended, he found himself king not because he was suited for it, but because he was alive. Because everyone better positioned had succumbed to fevers that physicians could not cure. He ascended to a throne he had never expected to occupy, ruling a kingdom that was mourning, traumatized, looking for reassurance that the worst was over, that stability would return, that life could resume its normal patterns. And he discovered that people did not want truth about the challenges they faced, did not want honest assessment of the plague's damage, did not want realistic timelines for recovery. They wanted comfort. They wanted reassurance. They wanted beautiful lies more than ugly truths. So he gave them what they wanted. He built his reign on this understanding, transforming governance into performance, truth into whatever sounded most pleasing when spoken aloud. The transformation was gradual, each lie seemingly justifiable on its own, each falsehood presented as the kind of diplomatic smoothing that rulers have always practiced. But the lies accumulated, grew larger, became more central to his rule until truth became the exception rather than the rule. Until honesty became something that happened accidentally rather than deliberately. His court painters created scenes of abundant harvests painted on canvas while real fields lay barren. The paintings were magnificent, golden grain stretching to horizons, farmers spooning with the satisfaction of productivity, granaries overflowing with abundance that existed nowhere except on surfaces covered with pigment and lies. The paintings hung in palaces and public buildings, creating an official reality that contradicted what people could see by walking through actual fields, by visiting actual granaries, by confronting the actual scarcity that made daily survival increasingly difficult. But the paintings were beautiful, and beauty had power that truth lacked. When people saw the paintings, they felt momentarily better, could imagine that somewhere, if not in their province, then in another, the harvests were indeed as abundant as depicted, that the kingdom as a whole was prosperous even if their particular corner of it struggled. His musicians composed songs of military victories that had never occurred, of enemies who had never surrendered, of glory that existed only in melody and verse. The songs were stirring, designed to inspire pride, to create emotional resonance that historical accuracy could not match. They told of battles won through courage and cunning, of foreign kings bowing before the superior might and wisdom of their own ruler, of an empire expanding in ways that existed in music but not in maps. The musicians performed in public squares and palace halls, their melodies carrying across cities where people hummed them while working, teaching them to children who grew up believing the lies embedded in verses so beautiful, they seemed like they must be true. Because surely something that sounded so right could not be entirely fabricated. His architects designed magnificent buildings as facades only, gorgeous fronts with nothing behind them but scaffolding and empty air. The facades were architectural marvels, demonstrating design principles and aesthetic innovations that would have been impossible in functional buildings that had to support weight, enclose space, serve actual purposes. Freed from the constraints of functionality, the facades could achieve perfection of appearance, could be exactly as beautiful as imagination could conceive, uncompromised by practical concerns. The kingdom became a theatre, all surface and spectacle, where every pronouncement was crafted for its aesthetic rather than its accuracy. Government became performance art, with policies announced not because they would be implemented, but because they sounded good in proclamation, because they created the appearance of action, because appearance had become more important than substance in a realm where beauty was the highest value, and truth was merely one aesthetic option among many, and not necessarily the most pleasing one. The people learned to navigate this landscape of beautiful lies. They learned to distinguish between what was announced and what was actual, between what was proclaimed and what was implemented, between the facade and what lay behind it. They applauded proclamations they knew were false, knowing that to question was to risk the king's displeasure, knowing that the king valued the performance of agreement more than the substance of truth. They cheered announcements of prosperity while their children went hungry, the cheering becoming its own kind of performance, a collective agreement to participate in the fiction because participation was required, because refusing to applaud was dangerous, because it was easier to clap for lies than to speak uncomfortable truths that no one wanted to hear, and that the king would punish for speaking. They celebrated victories in wars they knew were being lost, waving banners for armies that were in retreat, singing songs of conquest about territories that were being surrendered, maintaining the fiction because the fiction was what the king demanded and what their fellow citizens seemed willing to accept, or at least to pretend to accept, creating a hall of mirrors where no one was sure who was fooled and who was pretending, where even skeptics performed belief because the cost of honesty was too high. To question was to shatter the illusion, and the king punished those who brought ugliness of truth into his beautiful constructed world. The punishments were never for lying. Lying was encouraged, was the foundation of the realm, was the mode of communication the king preferred. The punishments were for telling truth, for breaking the aesthetic spell, for introducing facts that contradicted the carefully constructed narrative of prosperity and victory and glory. Philosophers were exiled for seeking accuracy, sent to distant provinces or foreign lands where their questions would not disturb the capital's carefully maintained illusions. The philosophers had committed no crime except asking whether proclamations matched reality, whether paintings depicted what existed or what was imagined, whether victories announced had actually occurred or were merely composed like music, beautiful in sound but fictional in content. Historians were replaced with poets, the study of the past transformed from investigation of what happened to creation of narratives that served present purposes, that made the current king seem inevitable. His reign a culmination of history rather than an accident of plague. His lies a continuation of eternal wisdom rather than a recent innovation born of insecurity and maintained through censorship. Scientists were asked to make their discoveries sound more pleasing to the royal ear, to sacrifice precision for prettiness, to describe their findings in language that was beautiful rather than accurate, to recognize that truth in the king's realm was subordinate to aesthetics, that a lovely lie was preferable to an ugly fact. That knowledge that could not be made beautiful was knowledge that should perhaps remain undisclosed. Yet, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between performances, the people knew. They knew their king was building a kingdom of lies, lovely and hollow as a painted egg, beautiful to contemplate but without substance, without nourishment, without the truth that sustains more surely than beauty ever can. They knew that reality could not be postponed indefinitely, that truth postponed becomes truth magnified, that beauty built on deception must eventually crack under the weight of the reality it cannot quite suppress, that facades, however gorgeous, eventually reveal their emptiness when storms come that require actual walls, actual roofs, actual structures that can shelter rather than merely appear. And in their homes, behind closed doors, where performances were not required, where the king's surveillance could not penetrate, where the price of honesty was lower, they taught their children to distinguish between what sounded beautiful and what was true. They taught that music could be lovely and still be lies, that paintings could be magnificent and still be deception, that words could be poetic and still be false. They prepared their children for a day when the facades would fall, when the music would stop, when the kingdom would have to face itself in mirrors that had been covered with paintings of imaginary splendor for far too long. They taught survival skills for a world built on lies, how to hear what was not being said, how to see past surfaces to the emptiness behind them, how to function in a system where truth was dangerous and lies were mandatory, but where some core of honesty had to be preserved, or humanity itself would be lost to performance. The king died as he had lived, making his death beautiful even as the reality behind it was ordinary. He died of illness, of age, of the same forces that claim every human body eventually. But the official account described a departure more aesthetic, a passing more poetic, a death transformed into art because art was what his kingdom understood, what it valued, what it had been taught to prefer over reality. His funeral was spectacular, a performance that exceeded even his life's performances. A final lie so beautiful that people wept even knowing it was fiction, even recognizing that the sorrow they performed was itself part of the show. That grief had become another aesthetic experience divorced from the genuine emotion it was meant to represent. His successor inherited a kingdom built on beauty and lies. A realm where truth had become so rare it was almost exotic, where honesty was revolutionary and conformity meant participating in collective fiction. The new ruler faced a choice: continue the performance or begin the painful work of truth-telling, of acknowledging that the harvests were not abundant, the victories not won, the buildings facades instead of structures. The choice was difficult because truth was ugly, was disappointing, was everything the kingdom had learned to avoid. But facades can shelter no one. Paintings cannot feed the hungry. Songs of imaginary victories cannot defend actual borders. And beauty divorced from truth is ultimately empty, ultimately hollow, ultimately unable to sustain the weight of reality when reality can no longer be denied. And so slowly, reluctantly, truth began to return to a kingdom that had forgotten what it looked like, that had to relearn how to value accuracy over aesthetics, substance over surface, reality over the beautiful lies that had sustained them for a generation, but could sustain them no longer. Because beauty, however compelling, cannot substitute for truth indefinitely. Because lies, however lovely, eventually collapse under their own emptiness. Because humans need foundation beneath the facades, need nourishment behind the paintings, need reality, however harsh, to build upon. Or else we build nothing, create nothing, sustain nothing except the illusion of creation that exists only until we stop performing, stop applauding, stop agreeing to pretend, and finally, painfully, necessarily, open our eyes to see what was always there beneath the beautiful surface, the truth we had been trained not to see but had never quite succeeded in making disappear. On plains where grass grew tall enough to hide horses, where the wind carried the memory of ancient peoples, where burial mounds rose like sleeping giants across landscapes that had witnessed empires rise and fall since before memory began its keeping. There ruled an emperor who feared history more than any living enemy. He had studied the past, had learned from tutors who taught him about previous dynasties, about emperors who had ruled before him, about the cycles of rise and decline that seemed to govern empires the way seasons govern harvests. And in that study, he had found not wisdom but terror, the recognition that every dynasty eventually falls, that every emperor's name eventually fades, that time is the enemy that no army can defeat, no strategy can outwit, no power can ultimately resist. His fear was not merely of being forgotten, though that fear was real enough, but of being compared, of being measured against predecessors and found wanting, of being placed in context that diminished him, of being one emperor among many, rather than the singular figure he needed to believe himself to be. His solution was radical: to erase context entirely, to destroy comparison by destroying what he might be compared to make himself not just the greatest emperor, but the only emperor, the beginning of time itself, with nothing before him worth remembering, because officially there would be nothing before him to remember. He believed the past was a burden, that memory itself was a form of rebellion, that to truly control the present, he must erase everything that came before. The logic was totalitarian in its completeness. If people had no memory of other rulers, they would have no basis for judging whether their current ruler was good or bad, competent or incompetent, just or tyrannical. If all they knew was the present emperor, then the present emperor would define what emperors are, what rule means, what was normal and what was exceptional. He ordered the destruction of all records predating his reign, the burning of genealogies, the toppling of monuments that honored ancestors. The purge was systematic, thorough, conducted with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that turned destruction into administrative routine. Teams of officials moved through the empire, cataloguing what existed before ordering its elimination, creating lists of what would be unmade, inventories of history that would themselves be destroyed once the objects they described no longer existed. Genealogies were particularly targeted because they created chains of identity stretching back through generations, because they positioned individuals within families and families within histories that predated the emperor's reign. Every family maintained genealogies, records of ancestors that connected living descendants to the past, that provided context and identity, that said, you come from these people, you carry these names, you inherit these legacies. The officials collected these genealogies, removed them from family shrines and private archives, gathered them in central locations where they were publicly burned. The fires consumed generations of memory, reduced carefully maintained records to ash, severed the connections between past and present that the documents had preserved. Families watched their histories burn, knowing that when the fires died, they would officially become people without past, individuals without lineage, present tense beings disconnected from the generations that had produced them. His scribes worked in teams to rewrite history, creating a new past where the world began with his coronation, when nothing of consequence occurred before his throne was established. The new histories were elaborate fabrications, composed with attention to detail that made them plausible, that created a consistent narrative where the emperor appeared not as a usurper of history, but as its inevitable culmination, the moment toward which all previous time had been building, even though that previous time was being systematically erased. They composed chronicles of his dynasty, stretching back generations, inventing ancestors who had never lived, fabricating traditions that had never existed. The fictional ancestors were given names, dates, accomplishments. They were described with specificity that suggested authenticity. This ancestor conquered that region in that year. This ancestor established that institution. This ancestor married that foreign princess to create that alliance. The fabricated traditions were embedded in the present, given ancient origins that made them seem immemorial when they were actually contemporary inventions. The empire was given a manufactured memory, a past tailored to justify his present, to make his rule seem inevitable, foretold, destined by forces that existed only in documents written the previous week. The manufactured memory served multiple purposes. It legitimized his power by creating historical precedent for it. It provided models of proper behavior that just happened to align with what he wanted his subjects to do. It created the illusion of continuity, where there was actually rupture, revolution, the violent imposition of a new order that wanted to pretend it was the natural continuation of an old order that had never existed. He built monuments, massive structures that dominated the landscape. But these monuments commemorated nothing. No battles, no heroes, no historical moments. They existed purely as markers of his reign, blank slates of stone and metal that said only, "I was here, I ruled, nothing before me matters." They stood like tombstones over the grave of memory itself, each one a declaration of erasure, a victory of forgetting over remembering. The monuments were enormous, requiring years to construct, consuming resources that might have built cities or fed populations, or any of the 1,000 things that empires need to thrive. But they served his purpose. They were impossible to ignore. They dominated sightlines across entire regions. They announced in stone that could last millennia that this emperor had ruled here, that his reign was the only reign worth commemorating, that whatever came before or after was subordinate to this moment, this rule, this singular presence that demanded acknowledgement while refusing to acknowledge anyone who had come before. The people adapted, as people do. They forgot their true histories, or claimed to forget, or hid their remembering so deep it became like a dream that might not be real. The forgetting was partly genuine. When official histories are rewritten and old records destroyed, when even speaking of the past becomes dangerous, genuine knowledge fades as those who remember die and those who come after know only what they have been taught, which is what the emperor wanted them to know, rather than what had actually occurred. But the forgetting was also performance. People learned to claim ignorance of what they privately remembered, to speak only the official history while holding secretly to knowledge passed down through family lines, to participate publicly in the emperor's project of forgetting while maintaining privately the memories he wanted erased. Grandmothers whispered fragments of true stories to grandchildren, passing down pieces of a puzzle no one dared assemble fully. The whispers happened in moments of privacy, in the kind of intimate time that surveillance could not penetrate, in the spaces where memory persisted, because humans cannot quite stop remembering even when remembering is forbidden, even when the punishment for speaking memory aloud is severe. The stories were fragmentary because completeness was dangerous, because possessing too much historical knowledge made one suspect, because the safest way to preserve memory was to break it into pieces, distributed across many minds. No single person holding enough to reconstruct what had been lost, but the pieces together forming a complete, if scattered, archive of what the emperor wanted forgotten. Songs survived with their melodies intact, but their words changed. Carriers of truth in codes the empire's monitors could not quite crack. The melodies were old, some dating back generations or centuries, familiar to people who had learned them in childhood before the emperor's campaign of forgetting began. The words were new, changed to remove historical references, to eliminate names of pre-emperor rulers, to scrub away anything that suggested time existed before the current reign. But melodies carry memory too. The structure of a song, its rhythm and progression, can suggest narrative even when words are changed. People who knew the old words heard echoes of them in the new versions, could reconstruct from melody what had been removed from lyrics, could remember through music what they were forbidden to speak directly. And in caves, in forests, in places the emperor's monuments could not reach, people carved symbols into stone, left marks that said, "We were here before you. We remember what you command us to forget. We hold the truth of our existence against your insistence that we began when you began." that we are only what you say we are, that history is whatever the present moment requires it to be. The carvings were risky. Anyone caught making them faced execution or worse. But they were also necessary, a form of resistance against total erasure, an insistence that memory had value, even when memory was forbidden, that truth persisted even when truth was officially replaced with fiction. The symbols were sometimes names of ancestors, sometimes dates of real historical events, sometimes just marks that said, I was here, I existed, I remember in the simplest possible terms. They were hidden in places that required effort to reach, that most people would never visit, that the emperor's enforcers were unlikely to discover. They were messages to the future, to a time when perhaps the emperor's campaign of forgetting might have ended, when memory might again be permitted, when the truth carved into stone might emerge from hiding to contradict the official history that had replaced it. The emperor lived long, his reign extending through decades that he believed would be remembered as the entire scope of meaningful history, the alpha and omega of time that mattered. He grew old, surrounded by monuments to forgetting, by histories he knew were fabricated, but had repeated so often they began to feel true even to him, by a population that performed the forgetting he demanded, while maintaining in secret the memories he could not quite destroy. When he died, the empire faced crisis. Not because his death created instability, but because his entire system was built on the fiction that he was eternal, that his reign would never end, that what came after him was literally unthinkable, because official history taught that nothing meaningful existed before him, and therefore nothing meaningful could exist after him. His successor, a son who had been raised in the manufactured history, who knew no other version, attempted to continue the project of forgetting, adding his father to the short list of emperors whose existence was permitted to be remembered, while continuing to erase everyone who came before. But the project was unsustainable. Memory is resilient, more resilient than stone, more persistent than imperial decrees. Gradually, the old histories began to resurface. People who had whispered fragments to grandchildren found that those grandchildren, now grown, were willing to speak more loudly. Scholars who had hidden old texts brought them out of hiding. The symbols carved in caves and forests were discovered, decoded, recognized as authentic histories that contradicted the official narrative. The revelation was painful for a society that had been taught one version of its past, only to discover that version was entirely fabricated. It created identity crisis, made people question what else they believed that might be false, undermined trust in institutions that had participated in the emperor's deception. But it also created liberation. To recover authentic history was to recover complexity, to understand themselves as inheritors of a past richer and more varied than the emperor's simplified narrative had allowed. They were not people who began with the emperor's coronation, but people with roots stretching back through centuries of change and continuity, of multiple dynasties and numerous emperors, of histories that were their actual inheritance rather than fabrications imposed on them. The monuments to forgetting remained too massive to easily remove, too much part of the landscape to simply disappear. But their meaning changed. They became monuments to the danger of erasure, warnings about what happens when rulers try to control the past. Reminders that memory is powerful, that truth persists, that attempts to impose forgetting ultimately fail. Because humans are remembering creatures. Because our nature is to connect past to present to future. Because we cannot be reduced to present tense beings, however much rulers might wish to make us so. And the empire learned, or relearned, what the emperor had tried to make them forget. That history is not burden, but context. Not rebellion, but foundation. Not the enemy of power, but the ground on which sustainable power must be built. That rulers who try to erase the past create only temporary illusions that collapse when those rulers die, leaving behind not the eternal reign they imagined, but ruins that serve as monuments to the futility of fighting against the human need to remember, to know where we came from, to understand ourselves as part of continuities that extend far beyond any single life or reign or monument. However massive, however loudly it proclaims that nothing before it matters, however insistently it demands that we forget what we cannot, will not, must not forget if we are to remain fully human. In lands where spices grew and monsoons marked the calendar, where temples rose in stone gardens that seemed to hold conversations with the sky, where the very air felt sacred in ways that required no explanation, because sanctity was woven into the fabric of daily life. There ruled a king who believed heaven could be bought, that salvation was a transaction like any other, that sufficient gold could purchase entry to whatever afterlife his priests described. His religion had not always been transactional. In his youth, he had been taught that devotion meant service, that faith expressed itself in ethical living, that the divine valued the condition of the heart over the weight of donations. But somewhere in the journey from prince to king, religion had transformed for him from relationship to commodity, from spiritual practice to spiritual commerce, from something he was to something he could buy. Perhaps the transformation came from the nature of kingship itself, from spending decades in a role where every problem could be solved with sufficient resources, where gold opened every door and closed every complaint, where power meant the capacity to acquire anything desired simply by commanding its delivery. When every human need could be met through purchasing, why not the ultimate need? Why not the need for salvation itself? His religion became a market, his faith a ledger of debts paid and rewards expected. He kept accounts of his religious expenses with the same precision he applied to state finances, tracking donations the way merchants tracked inventory, calculating return on investment where the investment was gold and the return was assumed to be years in paradise, reduced time in whatever purgatories his theology imagined, upgraded accommodations in whatever afterlife awaited. He bankrupted his kingdom building temples so elaborate they required generations to complete, so costly that entire villages were sold to finance their construction. The temples were architectural wonders, to be certain. Soaring towers carved with such intricacy that each one represented thousands of hours of skilled labor. courtyards paved with stones brought from quarries hundreds of miles distant, statues so large they could be seen from provinces away. Bells cast from metals so pure their sound carried for miles on still days. But the beauty came at a cost that the kingdom could not afford. Each temple required materials gathered from across the realm and beyond. Rare woods from northern forests, marble from southern mountains, gold and gems from wherever they could be purchased or plundered. Each temple required laborers in numbers that drained villages of working-age men, that left fields untended and families without providers, that transformed productive citizens into temple workers whose labor enriched the divine but impoverished the living. He commissioned prayers in such quantity that monks worked in shifts, their voices hoarse from constant chanting, their hands cramped from counting prayer beads that numbered in the millions. The monks had once chosen religious life for its contemplative nature, for the opportunity to develop spiritual depth through meditation and study. But the king's demands transformed monastic life into religious industry, into the mass production of prayers, whose quantity mattered more than quality, whose volume was assumed to compensate for any lack of sincerity. The monks chanted through exhaustion, through the point where words lost meaning and became merely sounds, through the degradation of prayer from communication with the divine to repetitive labor performed because the king paid for it, and payment required delivery. Some monks left their orders, unable to reconcile what they had become with what they had intended to be. Others stayed but hollowed out, going through motions that had lost their spiritual content, becoming professionals of prayer whose expertise was in production rather than devotion. He donated treasuries to holy men who blessed him while his people starved, their starvation apparently not a concern that interrupted his celestial negotiations. The holy men accumulated wealth that made them indistinguishable from secular nobles, that allowed them lifestyles far removed from the poverty and simplicity their scriptures recommended, that made them dependent on the king's generosity and therefore complicit in the system that extracted wealth from the suffering to donate to the comfortable. They blessed him in ceremonies elaborate and frequent, each blessing purchased through donations specified in contracts that detailed precisely what devotional service would be rendered in exchange for what material support. The relationship between king and clergy became purely transactional, stripped of the spiritual content that might have made blessing meaningful, reduced to exchange where gold bought religious performance, and religious performance justified the extraction of more gold. The temples rose, magnificent and terrible, their beauty built on suffering so profound it seemed to seep into the very stones. Workers died in their construction, from falls, from the strain of moving materials that exceeded human capacities safely to move, from diseases that spread in the crowded conditions where temple workers lived, from the simple exhaustion of labor that extracted more than human bodies could endure while maintaining health. Their deaths were recorded, if at all, as statistics in construction accounts, numbers representing labor units lost rather than lives ended. Sometimes their bodies were incorporated into the structures they had been building. When workers died during construction, it was often more efficient to entomb them in the walls or foundations than to stop work for proper burial. So the temples became monuments not just to the king's devotion, but to the unnamed dead, whose labor and lives had transformed his gold into stone. Gold leaf covered walls while children's bellies remained empty. The contrast was stark enough to be obscene. Walls so bright with applied gold that they seemed to burn in sunlight, radiating wealth that had been taken from those who needed it for survival, and applied to surfaces whose only function was to announce the king's piety. Children walked past these golden walls on their way to nowhere, their stomachs cramping with hunger, their bodies undernourished to the point where disease found them easy targets. Their short lives a rebuke to the king's priorities that he never permitted himself to recognize. Precious gems adorned shrines while medicine went unpurchased. The sick left to seek healing from gods the king had tried to bribe. The logic was obscene, that the divine would be more impressed by emeralds embedded in statues than by children given medicine. That sacred power could be invoked through jewels pressed into temple walls, more effectively than through acts of compassion. That heaven's favor could be purchased through materials extracted from earth, while earth's inhabitants suffered neglect. The sick came to temples to pray for healing that never came, their prayers rising towards ceilings gilded with gold that could have purchased the medicines they needed, towards statues adorned with gems whose value represented more than enough to have funded hospitals that might have saved them. They prayed and died, their faith unshaken but their bodies failing, while the king counted his temple donations against his expected reward in afterlife, never quite making the connection between the suffering he caused and the salvation he sought. The irony was lost on him, that his attempts to purchase paradise were creating hell for those who lived under his yoke, that his path to salvation was paved with the suffering of fools he never considered worth saving. He saw no contradiction between impoverishing his kingdom to enrich temples, between starving his people to feed his posthumous ambitions, between creating misery on earth to purchase comfort in heaven. His priests grew wealthy, their monasteries becoming palaces rivaling his own. They lived in luxury that made mockery of the ascetic ideals their religion theoretically endorsed, that transformed spiritual leadership into comfortable careers, that created a clergy more interested in maintaining their positions than in the spiritual well-being of those they ostensibly served. They assured him his investments were sound, that paradise was indeed for sale, that his seat in heaven was secured by each new donation, each new temple, each new ceremony funded by taxes wrung from people who could barely afford to live. The assurances were given with conviction that might have been genuine or might have been performance. It was hard to tell even for those giving them, so thoroughly had they internalized the transactional theology that justified their lifestyles. And the king believed them, because to doubt would be to acknowledge that his kingdom's suffering had purchased nothing, that his gold had bought only guilt-covered stones, and the loyalty of holy men who had confused worship of the divine with worship of donation, who had forgotten, if they ever knew, that the paradise worth seeking cannot be purchased, only lived toward through actions the king had made impossible by reducing faith itself to transaction, devotion to expenditure, heaven to a commodity he convinced himself he could afford while his people paid the true price. When he died, his funeral was magnificent, his body prepared with rituals expensive enough to have fed thousands. His tomb a monument that consumed resources that could have rebuilt provinces. He was surrounded by treasure meant to accompany him to afterlife, by prayers purchased by the thousands, by assurances from priests who promised that heaven awaited, that his donations had secured him place in paradise, that the gold he had spent would purchase for him what it had denied to those he had ruled. And perhaps it did. Perhaps there exists a divine economy where gold counts more than compassion, where temple construction outweighs human suffering, where the prayers of well-paid priests carry more weight than the unvoiced suffering of the poor. Perhaps the king's transactional faith was validated by a transactional deity who valued his donations above his duties, his piety above his people. Or perhaps, and this seems more likely to those who remember his reign, heaven cannot be purchased. Paradise is not for sale. Salvation comes not through gold given to the comfortable, but through compassion extended to the suffering, through recognition that we are measured not by the temples we build, but by the people we help, not by the gold we donate, but by the mercy we show, not by the priests we enrich, but by the hungry we feed, the sick we heal, the suffering we alleviate. And if that is true, then the king who purchased paradise purchased nothing at all, spent his kingdom's wealth to buy what cannot be sold, impoverished the living to secure an afterlife that his actions had made impossible to enter, built temples that stood as monuments not to his devotion, but to his fundamental misunderstanding of what devotion means, what faith requires, what the divine exists, actually values in those who claim to worship while oppressing, who build shrines while ignoring suffering, who purchase prayers while creating the conditions that make those prayers necessary, on an island where rain fell, soft as whispers, where the sea seemed to breathe against the shore in rhythms older than human heartbeat, where the boundary between water and land shifted with each tide, as if the island itself was uncertain of its borders. There ruled a queen who could not bear the weight of the world beyond her palace walls. She had not always been withdrawn. In her youth, as princess and then as heir, she had walked through her kingdom, visited villages, attended to the needs of her people with attentiveness that suggested she understood that rule was service, that crown meant responsibility rather than privilege, that the distance between palace and village should be bridged by care rather than widened by indifference. But the weight had grown heavier with each year of rule. Each decision affected thousands. Each policy had consequences that rippled through the kingdom in ways she could never fully predict or control. Each problem she solved seemed to create new problems she had not anticipated. The responsibility became oppressive, the burden of care overwhelming, the constant pressure of needing to decide, to act, to be perpetually competent and wise, and infallible in ways that no human actually can be. She withdrew slowly at first, then completely. until her kingdom existed for her only as reports delivered by ministers who learned to shade truth toward comfort, to transform crisis into mere inconvenience easily dismissed. The withdrawal happened in stages, each one seeming reasonable in the moment, each one a small step that made the next step easier, until the accumulation of small steps had carried her completely away from the realm she was supposed to govern. First, she stopped attending public ceremonies, claiming illness, or pressing business that required her attention elsewhere. The ceremonies had always felt performative, wearing ceremonial robes and speaking ceremonial words while accomplishing nothing concrete. Her absence was noted but not alarming. Rulers cannot attend every function, and delegation is normal, even necessary. Then she stopped receiving foreign ambassadors, trusting her ministers to conduct diplomatic business without her direct involvement. Foreign relations had always been complex, requiring knowledge of histories and rivalries and protocols that exhausted her, requiring her to smile at people she did not like and make promises she was not certain she could keep. Her ministers were capable, or seemed capable, and she told herself that her involvement added little value, that affairs of state could proceed just as well without her. Her chambers became smaller, more enclosed. She moved from the throne room to a smaller receiving room, then to her private quarters, finally to a single chamber where she spent years seeing no one but a handful of servants who had mastered the art of silence. Each move was justified by the need for privacy, for space to think, for relief from the constant demands that came with accessibility. Each move made the next move seem reasonable, made isolation seem like sanctuary, made withdrawal seem like wisdom rather than abdication. The chamber she eventually inhabited was modest by royal standards, barely larger than a prosperous merchant's bedroom, furnished simply with a bed, a chair, a desk, where she sometimes read or wrote letters that were never sent. The window looked onto gardens she never entered, landscapes she observed but did not inhabit, a world that continued beyond the glass, but that she had ceased to be part of in any meaningful sense. Her kingdom rotted around her absence. Laws went unenacted because she did not sign them, because her approval was technically required, even though she was unavailable to give it, because her ministers lacked the authority to implement policies without royal consent that was no longer forthcoming. Disputes went unresolved because the ultimate court of appeal was the Queen. But the Queen had made herself inaccessible, creating a judicial system that could proceed to a point but could not finish cases that required royal judgment. Enemies gathered at borders that had no defender. Only the ghost of authority, embodied in a queen who had ceased to govern, ceased to appear, ceased to exist for her people in any way, but rumor and bitter memory. The enemies were cautious at first, testing the borders with small incursions to see if response would come. When no response came, when border violations went unanswered, when it became clear that the kingdom had no effective leadership, the incursions became bolder, more frequent, transforming from tests into invasions that took territory without facing meaningful resistance. The ministers ruled in her name, signing decrees she never read, making decisions she never questioned, slowly realizing that her withdrawal had given them power she had abdicated without meaning to. Some of the ministers tried to govern responsibly, to make decisions they believed she would have made, to use their unexpected authority in service of the kingdom they were supposed to serve. Others saw opportunity in the vacuum, used the queen's absence to advance their own interests, to settle old scores, to profit from decisions they made while claiming royal authority they did not actually possess. The kingdom became a ship with no captain, drifting on currents of accumulated decisions made by people who served their own interests while claiming to serve a queen who had become more myth than monarch, more absence than authority. The drift was slow, barely perceptible year to year, but over the years of her withdrawal, the cumulative effect was profound. A kingdom that had been prosperous became struggling. A realm that had been respected became vulnerable. A people who had been cared for became neglected. In her chamber, she sat by windows that looked onto gardens she never entered, watching seasons change on trees she would never touch. The gardens were maintained by servants who worked without her seeing them, who kept the landscape beautiful, for a queen who observed it only through glass, who created living art that no one experienced directly except those whose job was to create it. She watched autumn leaves fall, winter snow accumulate, spring blossoms emerge, summer growth surge, year after year of natural cycles that continued regardless of human involvement, that demonstrated that the world proceeded whether she participated or not. Perhaps the observation was comforting. If the seasons continued without her intervention, perhaps the kingdom could as well. Perhaps her absence mattered less than her presence had seemed to demand. Perhaps withdrawal was wisdom, recognition that the world did not need her as much as the burden of rule had suggested it did. She read, filling hours with books that took her into other worlds, other times, other lives that required nothing of her except attention. The reading was voracious, consuming, an escape into narratives that had beginnings and endings and arcs that made sense in ways that governing never had, that presented problems with solutions, rather than the endless series of partial answers and new problems that real rule had offered. She painted, creating landscapes from imagination or from the view beyond her window, transforming observation into art that existed in 2 dimensions, rather than the full complexity of 3-dimensional reality. The paintings were sometimes skilled, showing genuine talent that might have been developed further if she had devoted to it the time and attention she had once given to governing. But mostly they were just adequate, the work of someone filling time rather than pursuing mastery, creating because it was something to do in the empty hours of self-imposed isolation. She existed in a world of her own creation, where the messiness of rule, the difficulty of choice, the weight of consequence for thousands of lives never intruded. It was a peaceful world, a quiet world, a world where decisions affected only herself, where mistakes hurt no one. where the burden of responsibility weighed no heavier than the brush she lifted to paint or the book she opened to read. She had chosen peace at the cost of purpose, calm at the price of abdication. The trade might have seemed worthwhile in the moment-to-moment experience of relief from the crushing weight of responsibility. The silence of her chamber was so much easier to bear than the noise of thousands of voices making demands, needing things, requiring her attention and judgment and care. The simplicity of choosing which book to read or which landscape to paint was so much more manageable than choosing which laws to enact, or which disputes to resolve, or which advisors to trust. And her people suffered not from her cruelty or madness or ambition, but from her retreat, her refusal, her silence that spoke louder than any decree, that said more clearly than words ever could. I cannot bear this burden, and I choose not to try. The suffering from her absence was different than the suffering caused by the cruel kings and emperors whose stories had come before. There was no violence, no persecution, no active harm inflicted by royal decree. But absence can harm almost surely as presence can. Neglect can wound as deeply as active cruelty. Silence can oppress as thoroughly as shouts. The people needed governance and received vacuum. They needed justice and received paralysis. They needed leadership and received void, emptiness, the shape of authority without its substance, the appearance of rule without its reality. When she finally died, quietly, in her chamber, tended by servants who had served her in isolation for years, the kingdom barely noticed. The ministers who had been ruling in her name continued ruling in her name, simply changing the tense from present to past, invoking her memory instead of her authority, maintaining the fiction a while longer before finally admitting what everyone already knew, that the queen had left them years before her death, that the woman in the chamber had been queen in name only, that the burden she could not bear had been transferred by her refusal to shoulders that carried it by default because someone had to and she would not. Her successor, a distant cousin who had been governing a province with more engagement than she had given her entire kingdom, arrived to find a realm that had learned to function despite rather than because of royal authority, that had developed ways of managing without effective central control, that had adapted to neglect by creating alternative structures of power and decision-making. The new ruler faced a choice: to restore central authority or to acknowledge what had emerged in its absence, to reclaim power the previous queen had abandoned, or to work with the distributed governance that had developed to fill the void. It was a choice the previous queen had made herself unnecessary to make, a consequence of her withdrawal that demonstrated that rulers are never quite as indispensable as they might wish to believe, that kingdoms can survive even absent leadership. Though survival is not the same as thriving, an adaptation to neglect is not the same as flourishing under care. And so, the final lesson of this chronicle of worst kings is not about cruelty or madness or ambition, but about absence, about what is lost when those who could lead choose instead to retreat, when power is abandoned by those who hold it rather than seized by those who seek it. When the burden of rule is set down not to be picked up by worthier hands, but to be left lying where it falls, creating a vacuum that is filled by whoever or whatever happens to be near when the absence becomes too obvious to ignore any longer. The queen who turned inward turned away from everything a ruler should be, created through her retreat as much suffering as the cruel kings created through their actions, taught by her silence that sometimes the worst thing a ruler can do is nothing, that absence can be as damaging as tyranny, that peace purchased through withdrawal from responsibility is not peace at all but merely personal comfort bought at the price of collective suffering. A trade that no ruler with any understanding of what rule means would ever choose to make, but which she made because she could not bear the burden, because the weight was too heavy, because she chose her own peace over her people's needs, chose her own quiet over their welfare, chose herself over the realm she was meant to serve, and in that choice became through inaction rather than action, through silence rather than decree, through absence rather than presence, as destructive as any tyrant who actively oppressed, as damaging as any madman who actively destroyed, as cruel in her neglect as others were in their violence, teaching the final lesson that power abandoned is power misused, that duty refused is duty violated, that a throne left empty is as dangerous to a kingdom as the throne occupied by someone who should never have been permitted to sit upon it. The end.